Hello, you're listening to Conversing the Classics. Today we are discussing the 1st century AD Roman satirist known for his short, witty, and more often than not, quite rude poems about individual Romans. Joining me today to discuss the life and work of the Roman poet Martial is Dr. Gideon Nisbet, Reader in Classics at the University of Birmingham. Gideon, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a real pleasure.
So, can we open the discussion by talking a little about what we know of Martial's early life and where do we get biographical information about him from?
Well, Martial himself gives us a great deal of information about his life and preferences and experiences, although since he is, by nature, effectively a bit of a stand-up comic, it's not necessarily all reliable. We know, for instance, just from his name, the date of his birth. He is Martialis. He was born on the first day of the month of Mars, which we call March. We know that he came from Spain, where he still had family. Spain had been the homeland of many notable movers and shakers in Roman society, including, for instance, Lucan and the two Senecas. He came to Rome as a young man from his home city of Bilbilis, where he had clearly pursued an advanced education in rhetoric, perhaps aiming to be a lawyer. Instead, he spent most of his life writing books of satirical poems. None of his contemporaries refer to him except once after he's dead, and that is the younger Pliny, who writes in an undated letter that he is sorry that Martial has passed on. Pliny does not expect Martial's poems to last through the centuries, and in that he was incorrect.
And do we have any idea as to his influences and reasons for becoming a poet, or is that again slightly ambiguous?
Well, Martial protests often enough that he is as poor as a church mouse and is in the game of poetry to make a quick buck, but protesting poverty was a well-established poetic trope. In other poems, he boasts of being a Roman knight, and we know the qualification for that was some considerable wealth. He was, in our terms, probably a wealthy man. Why he turned to poetry as opposed to pursuing the kind of career his parents might have hoped for, and why he wrote such dirty, naughty poems, is never going to be answerable for sure. We know many of his influences. The kind of poetry he wrote, Epigram, was traditionally a Greek form, and the poets who most influenced him were Greek epigrammatists, Greek poets in epigram, of perhaps a few decades earlier, Lucilius and Nicarchus. The influence that Martial most likes to talk about is that of Catullus, who, by the time of Martial, was dead and in his grave some century and more. And it's true that much of Martial does look back to Catullus, but Catullus is as much as anything a pretext rather than a direct model.
Okay. And now, I want to move on to his poetry, but before we jump into that, could you explain as to what exactly is an epigram, and is it kind of a unique form to Martial, or are there others within the Roman poetic tradition?
Epigram is not unique to Martial within the Roman poetic tradition, but it is quite unusual. A century and more before him, Catullus had written some epigrams. For those of you who've read in Catullus, all that miscellaneous short stuff at the end of the book, that is epigram. Catullus himself was probably inspired by Greek poets living in and around Rome, poets from the Hellenistic world, where epigram had taken off as a literary form. The name epigram means something written or inscribed, even incised, and epigrams began as inscriptions. A minority of inscriptions on, for instance, tombs or on the dedicatory statues put up by victorious athletes had always been in verse, only a minority. There's every indication that in the Hellenistic age, these started being collected into poetry books by the scholar poets of Alexandria, and then they became taken up as a form of poetry enjoyed at the symposium, the Greek drinking party that followed dinner, at which light, short, witty entertainment was always in demand.
Now, you talk about that Martial at certain times confesses that he's very poor, at others he says he's an equestrian, a knight. But in order to be a poet, as I understand it anyway, in ancient Rome, one needed patrons. Do we have any idea as to who was funding Martial's poetry, or...?
We have some ideas about Martial's patrons, and so, for instance, that letter of Pliny makes clear that he had offered Martial some money to pay for relocation expenses. This was on the occasion of Martial's retirement from Rome, he went back to Spain, back to his childhood home for his final years. So Martial certainly did benefit financially or in kind from the generosity of patrons who in return might receive flattering verses. We can't assume that Martial was absolutely dependent on this for his livelihood. The grant of his equestrian status may have been one such item of patronage by the patron among patrons, the emperor himself. But Martial himself clearly came from a moneyed family. He had acquired an advanced education in rhetoric, he knew his way around literature, and these qualities speak of a secure financial background for the family, clearly part of the provincial elite.
And like most sort of ancient poets, we only have a fraction of the work. Does all of Martial's work survive?
We believe almost all of Martial's work comes down to us. So in excess of 1,500 short poems, the majority arranged into 12 numbered books. And this seems to have been an innovation on Martial's part, not only to write epigrams and books of epigrams, as many Greeks had before him, but to construct a 12-part whole, perhaps, ironically, looking towards epics such as Virgil's Aeneid, which also has 12 books. So certainly, we know that the majority of Martial's work survives, primarily in his 12 numbered books, which are clearly the mega work for which he wished to be remembered. We also have 2 early books, the so-called Zhenya and Alpharetta. They bear Greek titles, but are gift tag poems, poems that could be attached to, or as Martial suggests, economically stand in for the kinds of gifts that would be given by friends at Saturnalia, the Roman Christmas. And these books too survive in what we believe to be their entirety. The one thing that appears a little bit broken is what we take to have been Martial's very first work or works. That is what's now termed the Liber de Spectaculis, the book on the spectacles or on the shows. And these poems describe and comment on the building of and the inaugural games of what we now know as the Colosseum, that great Flavian amphitheatre. The Book of Spectacles, as we have it, is a stub. It's much shorter than the others, and the poems in it may be of variable date. It may be the remains of a re-edition, or indeed of 2 longer books on roughly the same thing. We're secure, though, in our knowledge that we have the vast majority of what Martial wrote in the form in which he wished us to read it.
Okay. Now, Martial's poems are famously written about individual people in the city of Rome. Do we have any famous Roman figures appearing in Martial's writings, like ones that we can trace to other parts of Roman history, or indeed of the era?
Martial does often comment on individuals whom we know to be real contemporaries. Predominant among these, of course, is the emperor, Domitian. Domitian is the emperor who is ruling Rome for almost all of Martial's active political career. And there are many flattering references in Martial to Domitian, to his patronage of the arts, to his support of conventional morality, to his taste in pretty boys. So Domitian is a very frequent presence in the books. We find also references to contemporary creative figures, to other poets, to orators such as Quintilian, famous for his Institution of Rhetoric, the book on how to train young orators. So there are plenty of real individuals in there, and also historic names that are dropped, the names of past poets, past emperors.
Now, as for the unknown figures he addressed, which there are quite a few as I understand it, can we be sure that they are all real and not just invented to allow Martial a subject for his poems?
There are many individuals named in Martial's poems whom we do not have secure attestation for otherwise, and some of them are doubtless real. For instance, when Martial writes flatteringly to a patron, we can presume that the patron really has that name, because why otherwise would Martial write that poem? The patron wishes to be flattered. When we have, however, a satirical poem aimed at the butt of a joke, then we find often that the names are what are termed speaking names. That is, the names are often humorously appropriate or inappropriate to the theme of the joke. The names then have meanings, as ancient names often did, or they evoke particular literary evocations. So, for instance, we see that a lot of Martial's poems on frauds in the professions have Greek names because the kinds of professions in which they engage, for instance, medicine or rhetoric, are traditionally Greek professions. We see too that when people are accused of terrible vices, the names ascribed to those characters are also frequently Greek, because much like the French within the English tradition, the Greeks were associated with deviance and with lax morality. One of the names that puzzles me most is that of Martial's best friend, his bosom buddy. That is Julius Martialis, Julius Martial, who is often taken to be a real individual but is not otherwise attested. And I do wonder if that name, Julius Martial, suggests that what we're looking at here is really just the poet's aspirational alter ego.
And so he's obviously a reoccurring figure.
That's right.
Yeah. And are there other sort of unknown reoccurring figures within poetry?
Reoccurring figures whose names aren't full enough or are so common that we can't really say much about them. There is, for instance, Martial's friend Rufus, or rather two friends called Rufus, because one of them dies, it's very sad, and then a couple of poems later in the same book, Martial is saying, "Hey, Rufus!" to his friend Rufus. It's very confusing trying to follow it. So there are figures that keep on recurring. Some of them seem to have consistent characterization. At other times, the same name seems used for characters with quite different traits, and it may be just a matter of humour or metrical convenience, something that fits the line.
Now, a lot of his poetry is quite obscene, shall we say. What is the significance of obscenity in Martial's work?
Martial's obscenity is clearly meant to shock and to amuse. The Romans have a clear sense of what they consider obscenity, just as our culture does. They may not theorise it much, but they know it when they see it, and their sense of what was obscene is very like ours. Sexual and scatological terms were clearly meant to shock and provoke. They were not part of polite conversation. Martial's frank vocabulary is excused by him with reference to the greats of his tradition. So, above all else, by the use of frank and crude language in Catullus. This is Martial's great excuse. Whether or not he believes this, it's his great excuse. Martial clearly enjoys a low register from time to time. He enjoys suddenly lowering the tone with frank language. And it's a feature of his poems that creates interesting challenges for translators who must consider their audiences very carefully.
Now, out of all his work, and you obviously, forgot to mention at the start, but you have a published translation of Martial's work with the Oxford University Press. Out of all the work that you've dealt with of Martial's, do you have any favourite poems? Could you tell us why they're your favourites and maybe read one or two for us?
Certainly. I have many favourites, and one of the reasons that, having produced this translation for the World's Classics, I carry on blogging additional translations and thoughts about Martial is that there's never quite enough. I'm always finding more that I wish I'd included. And with the blog, I'm able to take a few more liberties as well. But I'll limit myself today to some of the poems that are in the book, and I'll just give you a sample of his range. I think, given the audience, I shall leave out ones with very, very rude words, because I don't want to get this splendid blog channel into too much trouble. It's actually interesting. One of the things that Oxford University Press did when they were trying to market this book and drum up interest was they have a big puff piece on the back about how it's so frank and unrestrained and uncensored for this new enlightened age. And they had me read out a selection of poems, but they came with a long list of words I wasn't allowed to say out of Martial. This was for videos that are now online on YouTube, and it was fine for them to publish poems with all these rude words, but they couldn't record me saying them. That said, let's move to some of the poems, and these are just a few that I like for various reasons. I'm going to start with a couple of poems from Book 2, and these have sentimental value to me because the very first little sample I did of my translations of Martial when OUP asked me if I'd like to translate him when I was doing the proposal was a little selection from Book 2. Nil recitas et vis mamerque poeta videri, quid vis esto, dum modo nil recites. You don't read out any of your work, Myrmercus, and still you want people to think you're a poet. Please, be whatever you like, just as long as you don't read out any of your work. And that is 288. 289. That you love to prolong the night with too much wine. This I can forgive, Garrus. This vice of yours was Cato's. that you write poems that Apollo and the Muses disown, entitles you to praise. This vice was Cicero's. That you throw up, Antony's. That you indulge to excess, Apicius. That you suck cock, though. Tell me, whose vice is that? And that was 289. I'll be interested to see if you can get away with that one.
I think we might.
Okay. This is a slightly repetitious one. That's part of the point of the joke. From book 3, this is poem 326, and it's about a politically ambitious individual with the name Candidus, which is clearly a name chosen for the joke it makes. This is a squeaky clean candidate who's ambitious to rise and has everything that the exquisite Roman lifestyle demands. He has the perfect lifestyle. You're the only man who has estates, Candidus. The only man with money. The only man with gold plate. The only man with murrine ware. The only man with Massic. The only man with Opimius's Caecuban. The only man with a brain. The only man who has talent. You're the only man who has everything. Don't think I'm saying you aren't. But Candidus, the whole city has your wife. Okay, the next one I'm going to read is a sad one. Marshall is often thought of as just a rude, witty, facetious, comic, satirical poet, and he is certainly those things, and a filthy one besides. But occasionally he'll turn around and do something that makes you cry. And this is a poem, it's an epitaph, one of several he does, for a slave girl that was his particular pet. And he loved her just as you or I might love a devoted pet dog. And this girl died young, and Marshall was heartbroken. And this is the longest and angriest of the poems he writes, when this beloved girl dies. And it's got a very radical shift in tone partway through, which a lot of previous critics, previous translators have said makes it very inauthentic, very artificial, but I think is crucial to the poem. And it talks in cliché, just as we do when we're in the extremity of grief. The only things that make sense are cliché. A girl more sweetly voiced than aging swans, softer than a lamb of Valentine Galicis, and more delicate than a shell from Lake Lacrinus. A girl you'd pick over Erythraean pearls, new polished Indian ivory, the first snowfall, and the untouched lily. A girl whose hair outdid fleeces of Baetica and braids of the Rhine and the golden dormouse. A girl who breathed as sweet as Paestum's rosebeds, or Attic comb's first honey, or a nugget of amber snatched from the hand. A girl who made the peacock look ugly, the squirrel unlovable, and the phoenix commonplace. Erotion lies still warm, her pyre still fresh. The bitter law of the vile fates killed her in her 6th winter. She didn't even get to see it through. She was my love, my joy, the games we played. And Pytus tells me I'm not allowed to grieve. He beats his breast and tears his hair. Aren't you ashamed to be sobbing over the death of some little slave? I have buried my wife, he says, and still I carry on. And she was somebody. She had pride, good breeding, wealth. Stiff upper lip, you've nothing on our Pytus. Comes into 20 million, and somehow he makes himself go on.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I suppose on the subject of death after that poem,
yes.
Do we know anything about Marshall's later life and death?
We know a certain amount about the tail end of Marshall's career. We know that, tired of the life of Rome, he retired in his old age to Spain, where yet another patron, a wealthy local widow, had effectively endowed a position for him. He was set up for life. We know, or certainly we're told in his final book of poems, which he published from his self-relegation to Spain, that not only had he passionately desired to return to the quiet country life, but that he quickly found himself very bored there, and found it every bit as vicious as Rome, but less interesting. We know that he died in the early years of the first decade of the 2nd century AD, so in or shortly after the year 100, because contemporary references stop, and then we have Pliny's letter. We don't know exactly when, any more than we know exactly the year of his birth.
And then after his death, how is his poetry received? I mean, I suppose what I'm asking is that with a lot of classical authors, their poetry survives through the Middle Ages, people like Virgil, because they're studied by monks and they're transcribed.
That's quite right.
Marshall doesn't strike me as someone that a group of holy monks would sit down and read and transcribe, given sort of some of the obscenities that he deals with.
Well, the afterlife of Marshall's epigrams is a peculiar topic. He doesn't seem to have had much influence. Marshall announces himself as the new Catullus, but for a couple of hundred years after Marshall, we see almost no activity in Latin epigram at all. Clearly, no one is in a hurry to be the new Marshall. Perhaps he'd simply broken the genre too badly for anyone else. Pliny wrote, of course, that he didn't expect Marshall's poems to live, and there's no strong indication that lots of people were reading Marshall either in his lifetime or after his death. Marshall claims that he is world famous, read across the whole of the Roman Empire, but that he does so in Poem 1 of Book 1, suggests a certain amount of ironic distance, perhaps that he's not to be taken at face value. We know that an heir to Hadrian playfully said that Marshall was his Virgil, presumably because Marshall has 12 books, modelled after Virgil's Aeneid, but if so, he was probably just trying to wind Hadrian up. After that, there's basically nothing. But Marshall clearly carried on being read and being copied, so someone was enjoying him. And actually, his Christian legacy has been quite comfortable. Marshall has long been a favoured text for learning Latin from scratch. It sounds peculiar to us today, but for many centuries, the way you learned your Latin, if you were at that kind of school, was you would start with short poems by Marshall, carefully selected ones, of course. Start with 2-line poems, then 4-line poems, then 6-line poems, and so on, because they were short and you could get through them, and he wasn't really that poetic a poet. And on the Greek side, if you went on to learn your Greek, you'd do so with epigrams from the Greek anthology in the same way. So Marshall was always around because he was forever being raided for school texts. Marshall was also enjoyed selectively by Christian moralists, just as was Juvenal, because one thing you can certainly say of him is he lambasts the vices of Rome. Never mind that he participates in them every bit as enthusiastically, those poems could be set aside. So Marshall then has had a long and interesting afterlife. He's been not only the bad boy of Roman literature, the one not talked about, but also the one studied ubiquitously in schools.
And I suppose then to talk about the actual Latin itself, you obviously have spent a tremendous deal of time with the Latin of Marshall. Did you encounter any difficulties or problems when translating Marshall's work?
Translations of humorous authors who make jokes, are always that bit tricky. Because, of course, part of the point of a joke is that we get it. That is, we realise there's a possibility of not getting it. Jokes work because there's something left unsaid, or because there's some clever play on words, and we need to feel our way into the culture and the language in order to get the joke, and then we're faced with the challenge of how to reproduce its effect for a modern readership, whose language works in a different way, whose world is completely different. Another challenge in translating Marshall is, of course, his frequent obscenity, and in the past this has often, of course, meant censorship, either by changing what is being said, dumbing down the effect of Marshall's Latin, or simply by picking and choosing which poems to include and missing out the problematic ones, and this has certainly been a frequent recourse. So one of the things my selection aimed to do was to redress the balance a bit. I've not just gone for the mucky ones, but there's a fair sprinkling in there, and I've made Marshall more polymorphously perverse than was the case in previous translations. So obscenity and humour are both tricky to translate, not least because our experience of the world is so different from the experience of the ancient Romans. We experience, for instance, sexuality in different ways. There's no way I could say to Marshall, I'm gay or I'm straight. The Romans didn't have words for it because they didn't have ideas for it. So translating those kinds of poems raises interesting challenges. Topical humour as well raises interesting problems. Do you translate the joke and not have anyone laugh? That's one kind of infidelity. Or do you tweak the joke? Have people laugh but do some slight violence to the intent. And I allow myself more liberties on the blog than I did with the World's Classics translation.
And in terms of then, to further the question a little bit, what kind of metre does Marshall use, or does he have a metre?
Marshall ranges across several metres. Most of his epigrams are in what's called the elegiac couplet, which anyone who's read Ovid will know, and it's the characteristic metre of most Greek epigram as well. If you've read your Poets in Translation, it's the one where in Ovid you see every second line is indented a bit. Every second line is shorter because it's missing a foot. Hexameter, then pentameter, and Ovid makes jokes about that from time to time. And that's a feature you've seen in ancient manuscripts as well. And Marshall certainly knows his way around an elegiac couplet. But another metre he favours is the hendecasyllable, the line of 11 feet 11 syllables. And that's a metre he especially favours because it puts him in touch with Catullus, who was the populariser of the hendecasyllable, the 11-syllable line in Latin.
Okay, now to sum everything all up, if there were only 3 things I could take away from today's podcast about Marshall and his work, what would you like them to be?
The first thing I'd say is that Marshall is very much a poet worth reading today. The issues he addresses are still live issues. Urban overcrowding, risky tenements, inequality, abuse, hypocrisy. These are the issues that still confront us living in cities today. Marshall was the first great poet of the urban dystopia, and he still rocks in that way. And he's still a great guide to ancient Rome, but also, I think, to many of our modern urban problems. The second thing I'd want you to take away is that more people should read Marshall because he's such good fun. He's an author you can pick up and put down. A translation of Marshall, a selection of Marshall, is many short poems and a few long ones. It's a great book to have about the house. It makes great bathroom reading. The third thing I'd like you to take away is that we're getting a whole new sense of Marshall these days. The latest scholarship, in which I'm a very minor participant, has given us a whole new understanding of the way his books work, of the way that he builds connections within and across books. He introduces cycles, recurring characters, recurring themes, recurring vocabulary, in ways that tie individual books together, but also tie the 12 books together into a greater whole. And that's one of the things I try to bring across through my selection, and it's one of the things that I hope people read Marshall for now. An author who has a consistent personality and who has a purpose in writing. It's not just random jottings. It's not just his Twitter stream. He's building out of those many little dots of poems a much greater and more interesting whole.
Well, that brings us very nicely to the end of the podcast. Gideon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oscar, it's been such a pleasure.
And
Thank you.
And if you at home enjoys today's podcast and want to find out more, or indeed buy a copy of Gideon's book or visit his blog, all will be in the description. But you can also get in contact with the Society by following us on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Classical Youth Society Ireland, or you could follow us on Twitter @CYSI_. For any direct inquiries, you can email us cysiofficial@gmail.com. This particular series of Conversing the Classics was made possible by the Classical Association of Ireland, with today's episode being edited by Michael Fuller. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you all next time.